Day 145 of the war, and the IDF has begun efforts to evacuate Gazan civilians from combat areas ahead of an expected move into the remaining Hamas stronghold in Rafah. And the army has also arrested Hamas gunmen attempting to escape the battlefield under cover of the civilian population. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz reports.
The army has begun the organized evacuation of Gazan civilians out of harm's way in Rafah ahead of a planned IDF operation into the last remaining Hamas-held city. At the same time, forces arrested a number of terrorists who tried to flee under the cover of the civilian population. A number of Hamas operatives were also eliminated after they were identified observing Israeli forces. IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari said that the war in Gaza will end in Rafah, but not before some conditions are met to ensure a successful operation in the densely populated area, where there are some 1.4 million people. The IDF spokesman said that the objectives for Gaza set by the cabinet are ambitious and will take time to achieve. Meanwhile, the IDF is continuing mop-up operations in and around Khan Yunis and in Zaytun neighborhood in Gaza City. Dozens of Hamas operatives were killed and weapons recovered. The IDF conducted operations against Hamas infrastructure and terror operatives in the Zaytun area in Gaza City. Israeli forces located a weapons manufacturing facility and rocket launchers used by the terrorist group and identified a number of terrorists inside a tunnel shaft, which they promptly destroyed. The terrorists were eliminated. At the same time, a major tunnel was uncovered connecting North and South Gaza.
צק"ח הנחל ויחידות ההנדסה השונות עסוקים בעת הזאת למצוא את רשת המנהרות שמחברת בין צפון הרצועה לבין דרום הרצועה והולכות מתחת למסדרון הקרקעי אותו צק"ח הנחל תופס. אנחנו יכולים לראות כאן תוואי אסטרטגי אמיתי של החמאס שמחבר בין צפון הרצועה לבין דרומה. הצק"ח ימשיך, יאתר ויחפש את המנהרות האלה, ישמיד אותם.
And U.S. President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are engaging in a public exchange over the conduct of the war in Gaza and the post-war vision after the war. Let's take a look. Speaking to Seth Meyers on NBC, U.S. President Joe Biden said that after the war in Gaza, there is an opportunity to change the reality on the ground for a more peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians, and normalization for Israel with the Arab world.
That gives us time to begin to move in directions that a lot of Arab countries are prepared to move in. For example, Saudi Arabia is ready to recognize Israel. Jordan, Egypt, there's 6 other states. I've been working with Qatar. And the bottom line is that I think the only way Israel ultimately survives, and I make no bones about it. I get criticized for having said a long time ago, you need not be a Jew to be a Zionist. I'm a Zionist. Were there no Israel and there's not a Jew in the world to be safe. But here's the deal. They also have to take advantage of an opportunity to have peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians who are being used as pawns by Hamas.
Biden said that moving toward peace would be unlikely with the current Israeli government in place, and Israel risked losing global support.
Israel has had the overwhelming support of the vast majority of nations. If it keeps this up without this incredibly conservative government they have, and Ben-Gvir and others, I've known every major foreign policy leader in Israel since Golda Meir, they're going to lose support from around the world. And that is not in Israel's interest.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a brief statement that specifically challenged Biden's claim that Israel was losing support in the United States.
מתחילת המלחמה אני מוביל מערכה מדינית שתכליתה לבלום את הלחצים שנועדו לסיים את המלחמה טרם זמנה, ומנגד גם להשיג תמיכה. יש לנו הצלחות לא מבוטלות בתחום הזה. משום שהיום מתפרסם בארצות הברית סקר הרווארד האריס, שמראה ש82% מהציבור האמריקני תומך בישראל. כלומר, 4 מתוך 5 אזרחים בארצות הברית תומכים בישראל ולא בחמאס. וזה נותן לנו עוד משנה כוח להמשיך במערכה עד לניצחון המוחלט.
And joining us now with more on the Biden administration's relations with Israel is Yaki Dean, the former Israeli Consul General in Los Angeles. Yaki, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So it seems that the president, with his latest comments, is sort of dialing up his rhetoric against Netanyahu and his government. What's your analysis on this?
So I would say that the president is maneuvering between his love for Israel, the fact that he supports the two causes of this war, releasing the hostages and eradicating the military and administrative capabilities of the Hamas on one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that he doesn't feel very comfortable with the government of Netanyahu, Ben Gvir and Smotrich especially, and the fact that this is a political year and he's being pushed and pressed by the Democrats, especially the left side. And we saw it yesterday in Michigan, in the primaries in Michigan. So I think this is, he's juggling between the two things. At the end of the day, we see, as you say correctly, I mean, we see harsher rhetoric. We see that Israel is being pressed more and more on certain issues, but on the main issues, which is the diplomatic umbrella that Israel is receiving from Washington and the ammunition that Israel is receiving from Washington, both of them are continuing and will continue. So on the pragmatic level, I would say that the support continues as usual. On the rhetoric, on few other issues, we see a bit more pressure coming from DC.
But because it's not just the rhetoric, you know, the U.S. has in the last week or so not just amplified its rhetoric, but it's also, for example, reinstated its policy of Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria as illegal. It's now requesting a formal Israeli commitment on weapons use, and is reportedly also pressuring Israel into accepting a hostages deal at, you know, sort of nearly any cost. And not to mention, of course, it's refusing to take a very firm stance against Iran. And so, you know, some critics are taking notice and saying that the Biden administration is undermining Israel's war effort. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
No, so they are increasing their pressure on several issues, as you said correctly, on Judea and Samaria, and the sanctions on certain elements and settlers over there, yes. On the fact that when they are supplying weapons now, they are demanding that it will be according to international law, and Israel has to sign for that and has to approve any humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. Yes, on those issues, yes, but on the main issues, as we see, Biden is still continuing to give his support, and this is not easy because around him, especially on the political circle around Biden, they're pressuring him very much to not only to harder the rhetoric, but also to use this leverage of ammunition, which he's reluctant to use. So I would say that at the end of the day, we see a bit more pressure coming from DC, but it's mainly on the tactical issues. On the hostage deal, I think we see eye to eye. There is an agreement, especially now, between Washington and Israel. Biden is pressuring, but Israel is fully on board on this hostage deal and still waiting for the Hamas to give their final answer. So this is it. But there is one cannot hide that there are strategic differences between Washington, D.C. and Israel, especially on the Palestinian state, on the American vision, which is the doctrine which is bringing in the revitalized Palestinian Authority, bringing on the afterwards the moderate Arab countries, Sunni countries, especially Saudi Arabia, and then at the end of the this process, Palestinian state, which Israel definitely refuses now because we see that, or Israel sees that, as a price for the terror of October 7th. So I would say there are major differences, definitely, in the doctrine, in the vision for the Middle East. But at the same time, when you look on the major issues, there is an agreement between Washington, D.C. and Israel. I would say, and humanitarian aid is coming in. So as long as the major things are continuing, we see and we'll see even more as long as the elections are proceeding and we are getting closer to November. So we'll see the rhetoric being harsher and harsher, but still the support is unbelievable coming from Washington. So Israel has to appreciate that.
So So very interesting analysis, and of course we'll keep following as the elections get closer. Yaki Dean, thank you so much for your analysis today.
Thanks for having me.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple. And moving on, Israeli officials are calling President Biden's comments on a potential hostage deal premature. Biden suggested that the agreement for the release of Israeli hostages in exchange for an extended pause in Gaza fighting would be reached within a week. But Israel, Qatar, and Hamas say a deal is still far from certain. More on this from ILTV's Steve Leibovitz.
Officials in Jerusalem and Doha confirmed some progress in hostage mediation efforts continuing in Qatar, but not to the level indicated by President Biden. While eating ice cream on the campaign trail, Biden said that the sides were close to an agreement.
Well, I hope by the beginning of the weekend, the end of the weekend. At least my national security advisor tells me that we're close. We're close. It's not done yet. And my hope is by next Monday, we'll have a ceasefire.
According to the latest reports, the potential agreement would see a 40-day pause in fighting in exchange for the release of 40 hostages and 400 Palestinian security prisoners. But Israeli, Qatari, and Hamas officials all said that there was still no breakthrough.
Over the weekend, Israel sent a delegation to Paris and subsequently to Doha, and the Prime Minister has updated the war cabinet on the next steps in the negotiations. You see, from Israel's point of view, we are willing. But the question remains whether Hamas are willing. Hamas are making outlandish demands in another orbit, another planet. If Hamas can come back down to reality, we'll be able to have a deal. Israel certainly wants it. We want our stolen people back.
A Qatari spokesman declined comment on Biden's remarks, but said there was no breakthrough in the talks, though Qatar was pushing hard for the agreement sketched out in Paris. He added that Qatar was upbeat and optimistic on Gaza mediation talks. A Hamas official, though, described Biden's statement as premature and not reflecting the situation on the ground. He told Reuters there were still big gaps to be bridged. Meanwhile, families of hostages held by terrorists in Gaza set out to march from the border community of Kibbutz Re'im to Jerusalem under the banner Uniting to Free the Hostages. The march is set to arrive in Jerusalem on Saturday.
And even with the ongoing war, Israel held municipal elections on Tuesday. There was low voter turnout and very few surprises. And unfortunately, not everyone was able to cast their votes, as there are still tens of thousands of Israelis evacuated from their homes from the Gaza border and Lebanon border communities. Let's take a look at the report. Israel held municipal elections on Tuesday amid the ongoing war in Gaza and Hezbollah in the north. Polling stations opened from morning until 10 p.m. across 242 municipalities nationwide, with hundreds of polling stations also set up on military bases at the front lines and in combat zones. Yet despite the vote, which was already postponed twice due to the war, there was very low turnout, with only 49% of eligible voters casting their ballots. And among Israel's major cities, there were no big surprises, as the majority of incumbent candidates held on to their seats. In Tel Aviv, Mayor Ron Huldai was re-elected. This will be his 26th year in office. Likewise, in Jerusalem, incumbent Mayor Moshe Leon won by a landslide. Yet despite the tremendous efforts to hold elections, the realities of war loomed over the voters. Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog cast his ballot in Jerusalem and not only encouraged Israelis to go out and vote, but also to support the families of the hostages.
אתם תראו דוכנים בקלפיות שונות ברחבי הארץ שמייצגים את משפחות החטופים, ובעיקר את הדרישה, התביעה והתפילה שלנו לראות במהרה את החטופות והחטופים בבית. אנא, גשו אליהם, חבקו אותם, הזדהו איתם, תתנו תחושה אמיתית של אחווה ושל סולידריות, שכל ישראל ערבים זה לזה, שכן אין מצווה גדולה יותר מאשר פדיון שבויים.
And not all Israelis were able to vote this year. In 11 districts, elections have been postponed to November. This as tens of thousands of residents of communities near the border with Gaza and the border with Lebanon are evacuated from their homes, still unable to return.
Maybe it's the smart decision to postpone the election for later, when people will be less scared to go back home. And if you walk around the town, you can still see places that are broken and missile hits and stuff like this. So maybe people are scared to come back.
And as Israelis are trying to get back to a semblance of normal life after the October 7th massacre on Tuesday, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant warned that Iran, Hamas, and Hisbah are hoping to take advantage of the upcoming Muslim holy month of Ramadan to proceed to the second phase of October 7th and ignite the region. In past years, the month of Ramadan has seen an uptick in violence and terrorist attacks against Israelis. And so joining us now in the studio with more is Dean Eldan, the international spokesman for the Israel Police. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to start with October 7th, and this was such a traumatic event for Israelis, and it really shook their sense of personal safety, of personal security. So I want to ask, what has the police been doing since that time to try and sort of restore the sense of security to the Israeli citizens?
So if I may, I want to go even a little further back, because it's not just since then. It was on October 7th, the first day, when the police were essentially the bulletproof vest for our nation. They were the front lines when the terrorists made their way into Sderot, into the 22 different communities that were running from their houses even to battle the terrorists, many of them with just handguns. We know the iconic Nova Music Festival massacre, and there 22 police officers gave their life. And when we were taking the bodies out and identifying our heroes, many of them had no bullets left in their handgun, and they were fighting these terrorists till the very last bullet and saved, over 2,800 civilian lives. So when we're talking about the Israel police, that's their main focus. It's very different in its formation than, let's say, a police force in America, where they're dealing with primarily crime and protecting public order. Here, one of our top priorities is also terrorism. So year-round, that's our main focus throughout the country.
And we just had last week a terrorist attack in Jerusalem, and now we're approaching the month of Ramadan, where, in past years we've seen an uptick in violence. And just today, the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, has called on Palestinians to storm the Al-Aqsa, to, inciting to violence, calling for terror attacks. What is the police doing to prepare or prevent, this type of violence?
So part of my job is also ensuring operational security. So you're going to have to excuse me, but I can't give necessarily our preparation plans and the things that we're focusing on. But like I said before, year-round our focus is public security, making sure that we're not just defending Jews, we're defending all of our civilians. We have many thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians and Muslims in our country, amongst our police force as well. Don't forget, a lot of people overlook that the police in Jerusalem are, many of them, Muslims and Christians themselves. Our focus is defending, protecting our home, our civilians. Now, it's not just on us. I do want to say that it's also important for the public to be vigilant. We're in a time of war. It's not a secret. We've had to raise our readiness level and our training with different units, like the neighborhood watch that we have, that just completed a very big training session in Tel Aviv to be ready for any potential attack that might take place there. We go over different things like that, but the public needs to stay vigilant. If they see anything suspicious or they're concerned about anything, to call 100. It's the police emergency hotline number, and that's what we're there for. We're going to give it attention.
And, has there been any change when it comes to police policy in dealing with terrorists and dealing with terrorism, especially in the wake of October 7th?
Our policy is the same. We have a zero tolerance policy for terrorism, and essentially if a person is going to endanger the lives of one of our civilians, whether it's a resident or whether it's a tourist coming in, he's gambling with his own life, because we're going to do whatever it takes to defend our civilians and prevent further attacks from taking place. You mentioned the attack right outside of Jerusalem. The terrorist was stopped by our civilians, and then also a police officer that was on his way to work. We might not be able to prevent every attack from taking place because there's lone wolf terrorists, there's different type of terrorism, but we are going to be there to react, and we are going to be there to defend our civilians. We are there for them.
And you mentioned sort of that civilians should stay vigilant during this time, especially during this time of war. But are there any specific instructions, by the police to Israeli civilians, how anything that they should be doing, especially now as we're approaching the month of Ramadan?
Listen, they need to educate themselves, first of all. But I'm not going to sit here and say that we should let terrorism dictate our lives. This is our nation. This is our home. People should feel free to move around. And like I said, also to keep in mind that we're in a time of war, to also not just against terrorism and the fact that they should alert the police if there's somebody suspicious, but to also keep in mind that we've seen rocket attacks still coming in from the north, from the south. Just last night, Ashkelon had a rocket attack and a vehicle was struck by a rocket. The public needs to also be made aware that if you're coming from abroad or if you're less familiar, to read up on the home front commands of how many seconds you have to get to a bomb shelter, that you need to stay in that bomb shelter for 10 minutes, because we saw in places like Tel Aviv or also the south where 6-7 minutes afterwards when the rocket was intercepted, that shrapnel fell right in the middle of a supermarket, fell right next to a car. People need to be made aware of these things, but again, this is our home, and terrorism is not going to dictate our lives. The police are going to be here for them, the IDF is going to be here for them, and that's what we do year round. The attacks that we do see, they're a drop in the bucket of the attacks that we've thwarted. And we're going to keep doing our job because we know that we're not just defending our people, we're also defending our families who live here. And that's why it's especially important to us.
All right, Dean Elsdon, thank you so much for coming into the studio and for all the work that you and the Israel police are doing.
Thank you, Lida.
And moving on, the cross-border exchanges in the north are continuing to intensify. In the latest barrage into the northern city of Kiryat Shmona, Hamas took credit for firing Grad missiles from Lebanon, including a direct hit on a building. The U.S. is warning that war could come soon. More from ILTV's William Sharon.
Hamas factions operating in South Lebanon under Hezbollah sanctions took credit for today's barrage of rocket fire at the Kiryat Shmona area this morning. In a statement, Hamas claims to have fired 40 Grad rockets from Lebanon. The IDF identified about 10 rockets crossing the border, one of which struck a building in Kiryat Shmona, causing damage but no injuries. Earlier, another 4 rockets were fired at the city, which caused no damage. Following the rocket fire in Kiryat Shmona this morning, the IDF claims to have shelled a launch site with artillery. The IDF responded by pounding Hezbollah targets, including weapon depots in Ramaya and a manufacturing plant in Kelbit Selem. IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi warned that Hezbollah would continue paying a very high price for its continued attacks on northern Israel. Halevi said the IDF was taking the right steps to enable some 80,000 displaced Israelis from Lebanon border communities to return to their homes. He said that as a result of the IDF's actions, Hezbollah is no longer close to the fence. The U.S. said that Israel is facing a legitimate threat from Hezbollah that will be settled either by diplomacy or military action.
They do face a real security threat in that there are tens of thousands of Israelis who do not feel safe returning to their homes in northern Israel. That's a legitimate issue that needs to be addressed. We want to achieve a diplomatic path. The government of Israel has said publicly, and they have assured us privately, that they want to achieve a diplomatic path, and so that's what we're going to continue to pursue, and ultimately that would make military action unnecessary.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Cloudy skies are expected around most of the country tonight with lows of around 13 degrees Celsius or 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we'll have a rise in temperatures and see more cloudy skies with highs of about 24 degrees Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all your devices, check out our ILTV channel, subscribe to our ILTV newsletter, and don't forget to check out our new and improved website, ILTV.tv, with all the latest news from the heart of the State of Israel. I'm the Darga Velazi. Be well, stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.